The rifle shot shattered the stillness of the Montana dusk, sending Eleanor Grace Jameson stumbling blindly through unfamiliar woods, her once pristine traveling dress now torn and muddied, her breath coming in desperate gasps. The men who had ambushed the stagecoach were still behind her. She could hear their drunken laughter echoing through the pines as they searched for the only passenger who had escaped their brutality. It was 1876, and Grace, as most called her, had left behind everything familiar in Boston to accept a teaching position in Helena. The stagecoach journey west had been long but uneventful until 3 hours ago, when masked riders had forced them off the main trail. The driver and guard had been shot almost immediately. The other two passengers, an elderly couple returning to their ranch, had been robbed and left bound beneath the overturned coach. Grace had slipped away during the initial chaos, clutching only the small leather satchel containing her mother's locket and the letters of introduction to her new employers. For hours she had been running, hiding, praying that the gang would give up their pursuit as night began to fall across the rugged landscape. Her legs finally gave way beneath her as she reached a small clearing. The temperature was dropping rapidly with the setting sun, and her thin coat offered little protection against the mountain chill. Somewhere in the distance a wolf howled, and Grace felt tears streaming down her face. 22 years of sheltered life in Boston had not prepared her for this wilderness, for the violence of the frontier. Another gunshot, closer this time. Grace forced herself to her feet, ignoring the pain in her twisted ankle. The scattered moonlight filtering through the trees revealed a narrow path descending into a valley. With no other choice, she followed it, each step a fresh agony. The soft glow of lantern light through cabin windows nearly made her sob with relief. A small ranch house stood in a protected hollow, smoke curling from its stone chimney. A barn and corral stood nearby, and several horses moved quietly in the shadows. Grace hesitated at the edge of the property. Who might be inside? The West was filled with desperate men. Could she be fleeing one danger only to stumble into another? But the sound of men's voices carrying through the trees behind her decided the matter. Gathering her remaining strength, she limped toward the house. She had barely reached the porch when her ankle gave way completely. She fell against the rough-hewn door with a cry of pain, then froze as it swung open beneath her weight. A tall man stood silhouetted against the warm light inside, a revolver held casually at his side. His face was shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but Grace could feel the intensity of his gaze as it took in her bedraggled appearance. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. Her entire body was trembling from cold, from fear, from exhaustion. "There are men. They attacked the stage. They're coming." The man stepped forward onto the porch, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond her. Without a word, he reached down and lifted Grace to her feet, then guided her firmly inside before closing and barring the door. Only then did he holster his weapon and turn to fully face her. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 30, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the harsh western sun. His eyes were a startling blue beneath dark brows, and a scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into several days' worth of stubble. "You're safe in my house," he said simply, his voice deep and quiet. "No one comes onto this land without my say-so." The simple declaration undid what remained of Grace's composure. Her knees buckled, and the room began to spin around her. The last thing she remembered was the stranger's strong arms catching her before she hit the floor. When Grace awoke, she was lying on a narrow bed beneath several warm blankets. A small fire burned in a stone hearth across the room, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Her muddied traveling dress had been replaced with a man's flannel shirt that engulfed her slender frame, and her injured ankle had been wrapped in clean bandages. For a moment, panic seized her who had undressed her. But then she noticed a woman sitting in a chair nearby, her wrinkled hands busy with knitting needles. She was elderly, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, and when she saw that Grace was awake, she nodded briskly. "About time, girl. Was beginning to think you'd sleep straight through to next week." "Where am I?" Grace asked, her throat painfully dry. "Who are you?" The woman set aside her knitting and poured a cup of water from a pitcher on the small table. "Name's Martha Hayes. I help Quinn look after things around here. This is Crossfire Ranch, though that don't mean much to an Easterner, I expect." She handed Grace the water. "Drink slow. You've been out since yesterday evening." "Yesterday?" Grace nearly choked on the water. "But the men who were chasing me. Quentin took care of them," Martha said matter-of-factly. "Rode out with some of his hands as soon as he got you settled. Found the overturned stage and the other passengers too. They're safe in town now, getting patched up." "Quentin, is he the man who found me?" "Quinn Xavier owns this spread. Been running it alone these past 5 years, since his pa died." Martha's expression softened slightly. "Good man. Better than most in these parts. Now, think you can manage some broth? You look half-starved." Before Grace could answer, the door opened, and the man from the night before entered. In daylight, she could see him clearly for the first time. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in simple work clothes, a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing muscular forearms, faded denims, and worn leather boots. His dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, and the intensity of his blue eyes was even more striking in daylight. "She's awake then," he said, nodding to Martha before turning his attention to Grace. "How's the ankle?" It hurts," Grace admitted. "But I'm very grateful for your help, Mr. Xavier." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Quinn will do. Mr. Xavier was my father." He moved to stand at the foot of the bed, his posture relaxed, but somehow still commanding. "Those men won't be troubling you again. Marshall's got them locked up in Helena. They've been hitting stages all along the northern route." "Were the other passengers truly safe?" Grace asked anxiously. "The Hendersons, they were kind to me on the journey." Quinn nodded. "Shaken up, but alive. Doctor says they'll recover." He studied her face. "Martha says you're called Grace. Got a last name to go with that?" "Jameson. Eleanor Grace Jameson. I was traveling to Helena to take a position as a schoolteacher." "Long way from home, I'm guessing." There was no judgment in his tone, merely observation. "Boston?" she confirmed. I needed a change." Something flickered in his eyes, understanding, perhaps, but he merely nodded. "You'll stay here until that ankle heals. Doctor will be by tomorrow to check on you properly. In the meantime, eat what Martha gives you and rest." Before she could protest or thank him, he was gone, the door closing firmly behind him. "Not one for long conversations," Martha observed dryly. "Never has been. But he means what he says. You're welcome here as long as needed." She brought a bowl of fragrant broth to the bedside. "Now eat. Then rest more. Town's a good 20 miles from here, and that ankle won't bear weight for at least a week." Over the next few days, Grace learned more about Quinn Xavier and his ranch. From Martha, she discovered that Crossfire was one of the more successful operations in the territory, running cattle on several thousand acres of prime Montana rangeland. Quinn had come west with his father as a boy, after his mother's death. The elder Xavier had built the ranch from nothing, and Quinn had expanded it considerably after inheriting it. "Not that it's been easy," Martha told her, as she helped Grace hobble to a chair by the window on her 3rd day of recovery. "Lot of big outfits trying to push the smaller spreads out. Quinn's had to fight for every acre." "Is that how he got that scar?" Grace asked, thinking of the jagged line along his jaw. Martha's expression darkened. "No. That came from the war. He doesn't speak of it, and if you've got sense, you won't ask." Grace nodded, understanding. Many men had returned from the Civil War with wounds both visible and hidden. Even in Boston, she had seen the toll it had taken on a generation. Quinn himself remained something of a mystery. He appeared only briefly each day, inquiring about her health before returning to his work. He slept in the bunkhouse with his men, having given up his bedroom in the main house for her use. Grace found herself watching for his returns in the evening, studying his face when he thought no one was looking. Behind his quiet reserve, she sensed a deep well of unspoken thoughts. On her 5th day at Crossfire, Grace was sitting on the porch, enjoying the spring sunshine and the spectacular view of the mountains. Her ankle was healing well, though it still throbbed if she stood for too long. Martha had gone to the henhouse to collect eggs, leaving Grace alone with her thoughts. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention, and she watched as Quinn rode into the yard on a magnificent black stallion. He dismounted with easy grace, speaking quietly to the horse before noticing her on the porch. "Should you be out here?" he asked, climbing the steps. "Dr. Miller said fresh air would do me good," she replied. And I was going stir-crazy inside. That almost smile touched his lips again. Fair enough. Mountains have a way of calling to a person. "They're beautiful," Grace agreed, looking toward the snow-capped peaks in the distance. "So different from anything I knew in Boston." Quinn leaned against the porch railing, following her gaze. "What made you leave all that behind for Montana territory? Teaching positions can't be so scarce back east." Grace hesitated. She rarely spoke of her reasons for coming west, but something about Quinn's direct manner invited honesty. "After my parents died last year, I discovered my father had lost most of our family's money in bad investments. What remained was barely enough to settle his debts." She twisted the simple silver ring she wore her mother's wedding band. "There was a gentleman who offered marriage. He was wealthy, respectable. Everyone said I should accept. But you didn't." "No. He was—" Grace searched for the right words. "He wanted a decorative wife. Someone to host his dinner parties and never express an opinion. I couldn't bear the thought." Quinn nodded, understanding in his eyes. "So you chose freedom instead?" "Yes. I had always enjoyed teaching, and when I saw the advertisement for a school teacher in Helena, it seemed like Providence." She gave a rueful laugh. "Though I admit, being ambushed by outlaws wasn't part of my plan." "The West has a way of testing newcomers," Quinn said. "Separates those who belong from those who don't." "And which am I?" Grace asked, meeting his gaze directly. For a long moment, he studied her face, those intense blue eyes seeming to look straight through her carefully constructed composure. "Remains to be seen," he finally said. "But you didn't scream or faint when those men were after you. You ran. You survived. That counts for something out here." Coming from Quinn, Grace realized this was high praise indeed. The next day brought an unexpected visitor to Crossfire. Grace was helping Martha in the kitchen, insisting on making herself useful despite the older woman's protests, when the sound of a wagon approaching drew their attention. "That'll be Rebecca Miller," Martha said, peering through the window. "Doctor's wife. Likely bringing some of her preserves as an excuse to satisfy her curiosity about you." Grace smoothed her borrowed dress nervously. After a week of wearing Quinn's shirts and a skirt Martha had altered, she felt distinctly unprepared for social calls. Rebecca Miller proved to be a friendly woman in her 30s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that reminded Grace of her favorite teacher from childhood. After examining Grace's ankle and pronouncing it healing nicely, she produced a basket containing not only preserves, but also several books, and a package wrapped in brown paper. "Thought you might be going mad without anything to read," she explained. "And these," she indicated the package, "are some dresses from my niece who's about your size. She's gone back east for schooling, so she won't need them for some time." "That's extremely kind," Grace said, genuinely touched. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need for thanks. We look after our own out here." Rebecca poured herself a cup of the coffee Martha offered. So, Quinn Xavier's been playing the gallant rescuer, has he? Half the unmarried women in the territory have tried to catch his eye, you know. None succeeded. It's not like that, Grace protested, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. He's been very proper. He's not even staying in the house. Rebecca's eyes twinkled. Of course. Quinn's nothing if not honorable. Still, I've known him 5 years, and I've never seen him bring anyone to Crossfire before man or woman. He could hardly leave her to die in the woods, Martha interjected dryly. And the girl needed tending. True enough, Rebecca conceded. But he could have brought her straight to town. The Henderson said he insisted on taking care of her himself. Grace didn't know how to respond to this information. Had Quinn really gone out of his way to bring her to Crossfire rather than to the doctor in Helena? And if so, why? Rebecca changed the subject, asking about Grace's teaching experience and sharing news of Helena. By the time she departed an hour later, Grace's head was spinning with new information and questions. Later that evening, as Grace sat by the fire reading one of the books Rebecca had brought, Quinn returned from a day spent checking fence lines in the north pasture. He looked exhausted, his face grimy from trail dust, but he paused in the doorway, watching her. Rebecca Miller stopped by, Grace said. She brought books and dresses. Quinn nodded. Figured she would. Woman can't abide a mystery, and you're the most interesting thing to happen around here in months. She said you could have taken me to town after the ambush, that most men would have. A shadow crossed his face. You needed quiet and safety. He moved to the wash basin in the corner, pouring water and beginning to scrub the day's work from his hands. Town's full of gossips and questions. Figured you'd had enough trauma. There was something in his tone that made Grace look at him more closely. You've seen trauma before? During the war? His shoulders tensed, but he didn't turn around. Saw enough. I lost a brother at Gettysburg, Grace said quietly. Thomas. He was just 19. Quinn dried his hands on a towel, still facing away from her. I was there. 3 simple words, but they held such weight. Grace felt the space between them change, as though a door had opened just a fraction. Is that where you got the scar? She asked gently. For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, he turned to face her. No, that came later. Antietam. His hand unconsciously rose to touch his jaw. Rebel cavalry. Got separated from my unit. I'm sorry. Quinn shrugged, but his eyes held hers. Long time ago now. Some wounds never fully heal, Grace said. They just become part of who we are. Something shifted in his expression, surprise, perhaps, at being so thoroughly understood. He crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite hers, the firelight playing across his features. What wounds are you carrying, Grace Jameson? He asked quietly. No one had asked her that before. Not in Boston, where grief and pain were meant to be hidden behind proper behavior and social niceties. Not even Martha, for all her kindness, had inquired about the shadows that sometimes darkened Grace's eyes. Loneliness, she admitted. Even before my parents died, I never quite fit the life they wanted for me. And what life did you want? Grace smiled faintly. Something real. Something that mattered. She gestured toward the window, beyond which lay the vast Montana landscape. When I read about the need for teachers out west, about children growing up without education, about communities being built, it felt like purpose, like something worth doing. Quinn was silent for a long moment, studying her face in the flickering light. The school in Helena is a good one. Town's growing fast. They'll be lucky to have you. If they still want me, I was due to arrive over a week ago. I sent word with Doc Miller, explained the situation. Your position's still waiting. Grace felt a rush of gratitude, mingled with an unexpected pang of regret. Of course she would have to leave Crossfire soon. Her ankle was nearly healed, and she had responsibilities in Helena. Yet somehow, in just over a week, this ranch and its taciturn owner had begun to feel like home in a way Boston never had. "Thank you," she said simply. Quinn nodded, rising from his chair. "Get some rest. Martha says you're determined to help with the garden tomorrow, and she won't go easy on you just because you're still limping." With that, he was gone, leaving Grace alone with the crackling fire and thoughts that kept her awake long into the night. The next week passed quickly, with Grace's strength returning more each day. True to Quinn's prediction, Martha put her to work in the vegetable garden, teaching her the essentials of growing food in Montana's challenging climate. Grace proved an eager student, finding unexpected satisfaction in the physical labor and simple purpose of coaxing life from the soil. In the evenings, she often sat with Quinn on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Their conversations grew longer, more comfortable. Grace learned about the challenges of ranching, the cycles of the seasons, the politics of water rights and grazing land. Quinn, in turn, listened intently as she spoke of her dreams for teaching, her love of literature, her hopes for building a life of meaning in the West. One evening, as twilight deepened into night, Quinn abruptly asked, "Do you ride?" Grace shook her head. "Not really. There weren't many opportunities in Boston, and what riding lessons I had were all about sitting properly side saddle in the park." "Can't get far in Montana that way," Quinn observed. "If you're staying in these parts, you should learn to ride proper." "Are you offering to teach me?" Grace asked, surprised. "Got a mare that would suit you. Gentle enough for a beginner, but smart." His eyes held a challenge. "Unless you'd rather stick to side saddle in town." Grace laughed. "I think I left proper behind when I boarded that stagecoach, Mr. Xavier." The next morning found her in the corral, dressed in the divided riding skirt Rebecca Miller had included among the borrowed clothes. Quinn led out a chestnut mare with intelligent eyes and a white star on her forehead. "This is Penny," he said, allowing Grace to stroke the horse's velvet nose. "She'll take care of you if you treat her with respect." For the next 2 hours, Quinn patiently taught Grace the basics of Western riding. His hands were gentle but firm as he adjusted her posture, showed her how to hold the reins properly, demonstrated the correct way to mount and dismount. By the time they finished, Grace's muscles ached, but she felt a thrill of accomplishment at having guided Penny around the corral several times on her own. "You're a natural," Quinn said, helping her dismount one final time. His hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary, and when Grace looked up, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Quinn!" Martha's voice broke the moment. She was hurrying across the yard, waving a letter. "Ryder just brought this from town. It's from the school board in Helena." Grace's heart sank as she took the envelope. She had known this moment would come when she would have to leave Crossfire and begin the life she had planned. Yet now, standing in the sunlit corral with Quinn's presence warm beside her, that life suddenly seemed less appealing than it once had. She opened the letter with trembling fingers, Quinn and Martha watching silently. "They want to know when I'll be arriving," she said after scanning the contents. "The spring term started last week, and they've hired a temporary teacher. But they're holding the permanent position for me if I can come within the next 10 days. "Well, that's good news, isn't it?" Martha said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "You'll be able to take up your post after all." Grace nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She glanced at Quinn, but his expression had become unreadable again, his earlier warmth hidden behind the reserve she had first encountered. "I'll have one of the hands drive you to town when you're ready," he said, his voice neutral. "Your ankle should be strong enough for the journey now." Before Grace could respond, he turned and walked away, leading Penny back to the stable without a backward glance. That evening, Quinn did not join Grace on the porch as had become their custom. Martha reported that he was checking on a sick calf, though her skeptical tone suggested she didn't entirely believe this excuse. Grace sat alone, watching the stars emerge above the mountains and trying to untangle the knot of emotions in her chest. She had come west for independence, for purpose, for a new beginning. The teaching position in Helena represented everything she had hoped for, a chance to build a meaningful life on her own terms. Yet the thought of leaving Crossfire, leaving Quinn, filled her with a sadness that caught her by surprise. In just 2 weeks, this place had become more home to her than the elegant Boston house where she had spent her entire life. Martha's gruff kindness, the rhythm of ranch life, the raw beauty of the landscape all had worked their way into her heart. And Quinn with his quiet strength, his hidden depths, his rare smiles that transformed his face and made her heart race. Wool gathering. Martha's voice interrupted her thoughts as the older woman joined her on the porch, settling into the second rocking chair with a sigh. Just thinking, Grace admitted. Everything has happened so quickly. Martha nodded, her weathered hands busy with knitting needles despite the fading light. Life's like that sometimes, especially out here. Change comes sudden, often when you least expect it. I need to go to Helena, Grace said, as much to convince herself as Martha. I gave my word. They're counting on me. True enough. Martha's needles clicked steadily. Though Helena's not so far that a body couldn't visit now and again, or be visited. Grace glanced at her sharply. What are you saying? Martha shrugged. Just that choices aren't always as clear-cut as they might seem, and that Quinn Xavier is a man who keeps his thoughts to himself, even when he shouldn't. Has he said something to you? About me? Didn't need to. Known that boy since he was 12 years old. Can read him like a book. Martha set her knitting aside and fixed Grace with a penetrating stare. He's had a lonely life. Quinn has. Lost his ma young, then his pa. War took something out of him too. Came back changed. Like so many did. Threw himself into building this ranch, never looking up long enough to see what else life might offer. Until now? Grace asked softly. Until you fell against his door, half dead from running. Martha rose from her chair with a grunt. Think on that while you're making your plans, girl. Grace barely slept that night, Martha's words echoing in her mind. By morning, she had made a decision. After breakfast, she asked one of the ranch hands to take a message to Helena, informing the school board that she would arrive in 3 days' time to take up her position. Then she went in search of Quinn. She found him in the barn, repairing a broken bridle with focused concentration. He looked up as she entered, his expression guarded. I've sent word to Helena, she said without preamble. I'll be leaving for town in 3 days. Quinn nodded, returning his attention to the bridle. Colton can drive you in the buckboard. Road should be dry enough by then. Grace took a deep breath, gathering her courage. I was hoping you might take me. His hand stilled on the leather. Why? Because we need to talk, Quinn. About this. Whatever is happening between us. Nothing's happening, Miss Jameson. His tone was flat, deliberate in its formality. You were injured. I helped. Now you're healed and moving on to the life you came west for. Grace felt a flash of anger at his stubborn refusal to acknowledge what they both knew was true. Is that really all it is to you? Just Christian charity to a stranger? Quinn set the bridle aside and stood, finally meeting her eyes. What she saw there made her breath catch, not indifference, but pain, carefully controlled. What would you have me say, Grace? That I've come to care for you? That watching you ride off to Helena will be the hardest thing I've done since burying my father? His voice was low, intense. What good would that do either of us? It would be honest, she said simply. And it would match what I feel for you. For a moment, hope flared in his eyes, quickly replaced by resignation. You have a life waiting in Helena, a purpose. I won't be the man who takes that from you. It wouldn't be taking, Grace insisted, stepping closer. It would be offering an alternative, a choice. What choice? To give up everything you came west for? To become a rancher's wife? Isolated miles from town, from the work you trained for? Quinn shook his head. I've seen what isolation does to women out here, Grace. Seen them wither away from loneliness, from the harshness of this life. Is that what happened to your mother? Grace asked gently. Pain flashed across his face. She died of fever when I was 10. But yes, she was unhappy here. My father brought her west against her wishes. She never forgave him for it. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration. I won't do that to you. Won't watch you grow to resent this place, to resent me. Grace moved closer still, until she stood directly before him. Quinn Xavier, for a smart man, you can be remarkably obtuse. I'm not asking you to make my choices for me. I'm asking you to be honest about your feelings so I can make an informed choice myself. His eyes searched hers, looking for doubt, for hesitation. Finding none, he slowly raised his hand to cup her cheek. I have feelings for you that I never expected to have for anyone, he said quietly. You've brought light back into a life that had grown dark. But loving someone means wanting what's best for them, even when it hurts. And if I believe that what's best for me might include you? Grace covered his hand with her own, holding it against her face. Helena isn't the moon, Quinn. It's 20 miles away. People make such arrangements work all the time. Hope and doubt warred in his expression. What are you suggesting? That I go to Helena as planned, that I fulfill my commitment to teach the spring term, Grace said, and that you court me properly during that time, so we can both be certain of what we want. A slow smile spread across Quinn's face, not the ghost of a smile she had grown used to, but a full, genuine smile that transformed his features and made her heart race. Court you, he repeated, as though testing the idea. Been a while since I tried anything like that. Well, you can start by driving me to town in 3 days, Grace said, smiling up at him. And perhaps by kissing me now. Quinn's laugh was soft and surprised, but he didn't hesitate. Pulling her gently into his arms, he lowered his mouth to hers in a kiss that began tentatively, but quickly deepened into something that left them both breathless. When they finally parted, Quinn rested his forehead against hers. If that's courting, I might not be half bad at it after all. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparations and quiet moments stolen together. Quinn taught Grace more about riding, promising that she could take Penny with her to Helena. So you'll have a reason to visit the ranch often, he said with a smile that made her blush. Martha, for her part, seemed quietly satisfied with the turn of events, though she limited her comments to practical matters like which of the borrowed dresses Grace should take and what supplies she would need for town living. On the morning of Grace's departure, the ranch hands gathered to wish her well, having accepted her as one of their own during her recovery. Even taciturn old Ben, who ran the bunkhouse, pressed a small wooden carving of a horse into her hand. Something to remember us by, he mumbled, embarrassed by his own sentimentality. The journey to Helena took most of the day, with Quinn pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the area's history. They spoke of practical matters, how often he could come to town, where Grace would be staying, when the school term would end. But mostly they simply enjoyed each other's company, the ease between them growing with each mile. Helena in 1876 was a bustling mining town, its streets crowded with fortune seekers, merchants, and the various enterprises that catered to them. Grace was startled by the noise and activity after the peaceful isolation of Crossfire, but she found the energy exciting rather than overwhelming. Quinn took her directly to the boarding house where she would be staying, a respectable establishment run by a widow named Mrs. Calloway. The school board had arranged the lodgings as part of Grace's employment, and she found her rooms simple but comfortable. I'll come back on Saturday, Quinn said as they stood on the boarding house porch. If that suits you. It suits me perfectly, Grace replied. I'll have settled into the school by then. Quinn glanced around, aware of curious eyes watching them from neighboring houses. With a wry smile, he took Grace's hand and pressed a formal kiss to her knuckles. Until Saturday, Miss Jameson. The first weeks of teaching proved both challenging and rewarding. The school in Helena was a single room with students ranging from 6 to 16 years of age. Many came from mining families, others from the ranches and farms surrounding the town. All were eager to learn, though their previous education varied widely. Grace threw herself into the work, developing individual programs for students at different levels and introducing books and ideas that many had never encountered before. She organized a lending library from her own small collection, and those donated by townspeople, encouraged debates among the older students, and started a school newspaper. True to his word, Quinn came to Helena every Saturday. Sometimes he would stay only for the day, taking Grace to dinner at the hotel restaurant or for walks along the bustling streets. Other times, he would remain through Sunday, attending church with her and joining her for dinner at the boarding house under Mrs. Calloway's watchful eye. Their courtship progressed with a sweetness that surprised them both. Quinn, so long accustomed to keeping his thoughts and feelings private, found himself opening up to Grace in ways he never had with anyone. He told her about his childhood in Missouri, about his father's dreams of building something lasting in the West, about the horrors he had witnessed during the war and the nightmares that still sometimes haunted him. Grace, in turn, shared her own hopes and fears. She spoke of her sheltered upbringing, of the mother who had secretly encouraged her love of learning even while preparing her for a conventional marriage, of her determination to create a life of purpose and meaning. As spring deepened into summer, their feelings for each other grew stronger. Quinn became a familiar figure in Helena, greeted by name by shopkeepers and Grace's students alike. Grace visited Crossfire whenever her teaching schedule allowed, spending peaceful weekends helping Martha in the garden and riding Penny across the ranch's sprawling acres. It was during one such visit, as they rode along a ridge overlooking a valley filled with wildflowers, that Quinn finally asked the question that had been on his mind for weeks. "I've been thinking," he began, drawing Penny alongside his own mount. "The school term ends in August." "Yes," Grace agreed, wondering where he was going with this observation. "And they've asked you to stay on for the fall term." "They have. I haven't given them an answer yet." Quinn nodded, his eyes on the distant mountains. "I've been building something these past weeks. Want to show it to you?" Intrigued, Grace followed as he led the way back to the ranch, but instead of returning to the main house, he took her to a rise about half a mile away. There, nestled among a stand of pines with a view of both the mountains and the ranch below, stood a small cabin, newly built. "Quinn," Grace breathed as they dismounted. "What is this?" He took her hand, leading her toward the structure. "Thought you might want a place of your own, if you decided to stay on at Crossfire." The cabin was simple but beautifully crafted, with a covered porch facing the mountains and large windows to capture the light. Inside, Grace found a cozy living area with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and 2 bedrooms, one set up as a sleeping chamber, the other as a study, with empty bookshelves lining the walls. "It's perfect," she whispered, turning to find Quinn watching her nervously. "There's a school about 5 miles from here," he said. "Small place, mostly ranch families. They've never had a proper teacher, just whoever could be spared during winter months when ranch work is slower." He hesitated. "I spoke with them last week. They'd be mighty pleased to have someone with your experience." Grace's heart swelled with emotion as she understood what he was offering, not a choice between teaching and ranch life, but a way to have both. A compromise that honored her needs as well as his. "And where would you be in this arrangement?" she asked softly. Quinn swallowed hard. Where you want me to be? Could be your nearest neighbor, checking in from time to time. He took a step closer. Or could be more, if you were willing. More? In answer, Quinn reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. Belonged to my mother, he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold ring set with a single pearl. My father gave it to her when he asked her to marry him. She gave it to me before she died, said to save it for a woman who chose this life freely, with open eyes and a full heart. Grace felt tears welling in her eyes as Quinn dropped to one knee before her. Grace Jameson, I love you, have since you fell against my door that night, though it took me a while to admit it even to myself. You've brought joy and purpose back into my life. He held up the ring. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Yes, Grace whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Yes, Quinn Xavier, I will marry you. The smile that illuminated his face as he slipped the ring onto her finger was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Rising to his feet, he gathered her in his arms and kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of promises kept and a future built together. They were married in late August, after the school term ended, in a ceremony held on the porch of the new cabin. Martha, beaming with satisfaction, had overseen preparations that brought together the entire Crossfire community, along with many of Grace's students and their families from Helena. The small schoolhouse near the ranch had been officially offered to Grace, who had accepted with enthusiasm, already planning lessons and making lists of books and supplies she would need. Rebecca Miller attended with her husband, both clearly pleased by the match they had, in some way helped to foster. Told you he was just waiting for the right woman, Rebecca whispered to Grace as they shared a quiet moment before the ceremony. Never seen Quinn Xavier so happy. The Hendersons, the elderly couple who had been Grace's fellow passengers on that fateful stagecoach journey, also made the trip from their own ranch 50 miles away. When we heard you were marrying Quinn Xavier, we couldn't miss it, Mrs. Henderson told Grace. Always knew that young man would find someone special one day. Just glad it was you, dear. As Grace stood beside Quinn, speaking vows that would bind them together before God and their community, she thought of all the twists and turns that had led her to this moment. The loss of her parents, the decision to leave Boston, the terrifying ambush that had sent her fleeing through unknown wilderness all had brought her, ultimately, to Crossfire Ranch, and to the man who now placed a gold band on her finger. I promise to cherish and respect you, Quinn said, his voice steady and sure. To support your dreams as you have supported mine, to build a life of meaning with you, come what may. I promise to stand beside you in all things, Grace responded. To create a home filled with love and learning. To face each day's challenges and joys as your equal partner and your loving wife. As the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the setting sun bathed the gathering in golden light. Quinn kissed his bride to the cheers and applause of their friends, his blue eyes filled with a happiness that Grace knew mirrored her own. Later, as twilight deepened into night and the last guests departed, Quinn led Grace to the porch of their new home. Above them, stars were beginning to appear in the vast Montana sky, more stars than Grace had ever imagined possible during her years in the city. Happy, Mrs. Xavier? Quinn asked, his arm around her waist. More than I ever thought possible, Grace answered honestly, though I expect marriage to a rancher won't always be this peaceful. Quinn laughed softly. No. There'll be hard winters and dry summers. Cattle prices will fall, fences will need mending, and that school of yours will have its share of challenges. He turned her gently to face him. But we'll face it together, and that makes all the difference. As Quinn lowered his mouth to hers in a kiss that held both promise and passion, Grace knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in the world. Not in the comfortable drawing rooms of Boston, nor solely in the classroom she had traveled so far to find, but here in the arms of a man who had opened his home and his heart to a pale, trembling stranger on a stormy night, and in doing so had changed both their lives forever. Over the years that followed, Crossfire Ranch prospered under their joint stewardship. The school Grace established became known throughout the territory for its excellence, drawing students from nearby ranches and even from Helena as its reputation grew. Quinn expanded the cattle operation, employing more hands and becoming one of the most respected ranchers in the region. They weathered challenges together: the harsh winter of '78 that nearly decimated their herd, the summer drought of '80 that turned pastures to dust, the difficult birth of their first child that had both Quinn and Martha pacing anxiously as the doctor worked through the night to save both mother and baby. But they also celebrated countless joys: the birth of that daughter, whom they named Sarah after Quinn's mother, followed 2 years later by a son they called James. The completion of a proper schoolhouse to replace the one-room cabin where Grace had first taught. The railroad's arrival, connecting them more easily to the wider world while allowing them to maintain the life they had built together. Through it all, they never forgot the night that had brought them together: a frightened young woman from the east, fleeing for her life, and a solitary rancher who had opened his door and spoken the words that changed everything: "You're safe in my house." That house became a home not just for them and their growing family, but for all who sought shelter within its walls: travelers, new settlers, orphaned children, aging ranch hands with nowhere else to go, all found welcome at Crossfire. And at the center of it all were Quinn and Grace, their love a beacon that guided others toward the possibility of building something lasting in this wild, beautiful land. On their 20th anniversary, as they sat together on the porch of the main house, expanded now to accommodate their family and frequent guests, Quinn took Grace's hand, rubbing his thumb over the wedding band that had never left her finger. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Giving up Boston? The life you might have had there?" Grace looked out over the ranch that had been her home for 2 decades, at the garden where Martha still worked alongside their daughter, at the corral where James was breaking a new colt under Quinn's careful instruction, at the schoolhouse on the hill where she still taught 3 days each week. "Not for a single moment," she said, and the truth of it shone in her eyes. "This is exactly where I was meant to be." Quinn's smile, no longer rare, but no less precious for its frequency, warmed her heart as it had since that first day on the porch, when a pale and trembling stranger had begun to realize that safety could be found in more than just a house. It could be found in the arms of a man who understood her heart, who valued her strength as well as her softness, who had built his life around ensuring that she would never have reason to tremble in fear again. "I love you, Grace Xavier," he said simply. "And I love you," she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder as the Montana sunset painted the sky in colors no Boston artist could have captured. "Yesterday, today, and all the tomorrows yet to come."